So today I would like to start our meeting with a little bit of our theme. Michelle Hadrick was supposed to be our Toastmaster, and unfortunately she had something come up. And the topic was interesting. It's our national defense, and in particular how Islamic fascism dovetails into that. And is that a problem? I started thinking last night, well, what is the proper role of government? What is it that our federal government should be doing? To me, it's a simple question. They should be protecting our individual rights, whether that's a strong court system to adjudicate our differences, or perhaps it's to have a police force to help us when there are criminals or something illicit happening within our confines. And then last but not least, our defense of our country, to protect us against foreign enemies. Well, I'm not an expert on defense. I'm not an expert on Islamic fascism, but I have read. I like to read a lot. As my wife will say, what are you going to be doing tonight? And I say, read. And she says, yeah, I know that. So why do I ask the question? I've got a lot of books up here that I've read. In 2009, I had the good fortune of listening to and being really moved by a lady who, I've never seen this happen. I know there's several LPR grads in here in the room. But Bridget Gabrielle was one of our speakers, and her speech was so powerful there was not a dry eye in the room. Why is that? Well, her personal story, and we always talk in Toastmasters about our stories. Bridget grew up in Lebanon, in a Christian area of a village of Lebanon, southern Lebanon. And her story is a story of survival in her country because of radical Islam saying, we don't want your kind here. Very different than America's experience. But when I read her book and heard her story, and I've since heard her speak several times, I was moved because it's a very similar experience of my heritage of being Jewish. And what was interesting and what struck me most about Bridget Gabrielle was when her father was wounded in one of the battles, and they would have to crawl on their stomachs to get water and food in their village, always being shot at as a little girl. Her mother made sure she was always dressed nicely, in her best dress, because it could have been the last time her mother ever saw her, and she wanted her to be buried in her finest. So this one time her father was wounded. I think it was her father. It could have been her mother. One of her parents were wounded. Long story short, they had to take him to a area where there were ambulances. They were evacuated into Israel. And her mother said, here's all the money in the world I have. Take it, because you're going to have to pay a bribe to get your parent into that hospital. Well, when she was in the ambulance, she was with her parent. They got to the hospital, and when she had the opportunity to talk to the ambulance driver, she gave all the money to him, just gave it to him. And he looked at it and said, what's that for? And she said, well, that's to get my parent to the hospital and to pay you. She says, we don't take money for that. That's what we do. That's your money. That's not my money. And she knew right then and there she was in a country that was very different from hers. And that got me thinking about how lucky we are in our country to have a system to where people understand the rule of law, as opposed to a country where there's the rule of lawlessness. So that got me out. I started on a journey of reading. And next I got to meet Catherine Herridge, another speaker, and she's a Fox News reporter. And this story, this next wave about Islamic fascism that's happening in the Middle East and actually around the world now. Again, lots of documentation, footnoted, personal experiences. And as a reader, I start to investigate. I want to know both sides. And so I start reading a little bit about the Quran and the history of it. And I got to hear a gentleman by the name of I'm going to mess up his name, Dr. Federer, at a retreat. And he explained Islam in an interesting way, kind of like a record, RPM, and this is how I remember it. First, it was a religious movement. Muhammad was a caravan herder in the desert. And one day he went to meditate and went into a cave, and he heard this voice, as the story goes. And this voice he thought was God, and he said, write. And Muhammad said, I do not know how to write. And the voice was insistent. He said, write. And he kept asking him to write. And Muhammad said, I don't know how. And finally, he just started writing. And that's supposedly where we get the Quran from. And then after a while, he started to go to try to get people to listen to him. And back in the 7th century, in Mecca and Medina, where he was in these villages, were actually Jewish tribal villages. Most people don't know that there was Jews in Mecca and Medina because of the current situation. But basically, he tried to get those folks to convert to his way of thinking. And over time, what happened was he became a little bit more political, getting the 2 tribes or 3 tribes, depending on the city he was in, to fight each other. And he was pretty successful in that. And over time, his religion, as it became more militaristic. And if you didn't agree with his philosophy, basically whole groups of people would be slaughtered. It's an interesting history. And so as a reader and listening to other people speak, I started to question, okay, what is this about this philosophy, this religion, that is a threat? Is it a threat? And that got me on a journey to reading many more books. And I'll be interjecting throughout the presentation today a little bit of what I've learned and want to share it with you as well. So leadership is important in national defense, and we've always had a difference of opinion. Should we protect our borders and stay here isolationist, or should we go overseas and help our friends? And that's a great discussion to have. But today we have a group of leaders that are going to be leading our meeting. That's a transition. Mm-hmm. And I want to have the opportunity to introduce them. And our general evaluator today is Ellen Hilliard. And Ellen's got a team. So Ellen, why don't you come up and share with us a little bit about that? Thank you, ma'am. I'm meeting a man who actually was and is marked for death. In fact, that's the title of his book, Geert Wilders, who's a Dutch parliamentarian. And I was at the Western Conservative Summit a couple years ago. I have never seen security for an individual like this one in my life. There was not only Secret Service, police on every building top around the Hilton or the Hyatt Regency downtown, undercover. There was Dutch police and Secret Service. Why? Because Geert Wilders lives in Holland, Amsterdam, and he has to live in a different house every day because he has a fatwa, or a edict by Islamists who want to kill him because he does not agree with their philosophy. He did a film, and you can go online and look it up. It's called Fitna, F-I-T-N-A. And it's simply a film that documents what folks are saying in the Middle East through a variety of sources. Actual footage of clerics talking about Islam and what they want to do with the world. I'll let you make your own judgment up. But when I got to meet him, it was almost eerie because I thought as soon as I shook his hand and asked him for his book, and as well took a picture with him, do I have a fatwa in my head just because I'm listening to him? Interesting proposition. A couple years ago, and this was at a Grace Church in, I think they're in Lakewood, big mega church, and they always have interesting speakers, and had the opportunity to hear 2 of them. One is Pamela Geller, and Pamela Geller has Atlas Shrugged. And she's a very dynamic speaker who, as her book entitled, Stop the Islamization of America. She's from New York. And with her was Robert Spencer. And he's written several books. This one I find most interesting, Did Muhammad Exist? Pretty provocative title. Both of them were in New York City when 9/11 happened, and they came out with a video, Ground Zero Mosque, which I'm happy to share with people. And the group of folks that were trying to create an Islamic center just a block and a half away from Ground Zero. Interesting perspectives. The reason I bring them up to this topic of national defense is because we were attacked on 9/11. A lot of people say we provoked it. And yet, if you look at the history of the world, and in particular, if you read anything by Victor David Hanson, who is a classicist, and he has spoken at Hillsdale College and various other places where he's a fellow at the Hoover Institution, you listen, and I look for answers a lot of times, and in particular to history. And you look to the Greeks and the Romans and how they dealt with marauders and people, the Goths and the Visigoths and the people that were attacking their societies. And he says it's pretty clear within his purview of the world. He wrote in an Imprimis article, Victor David Hanson did, a real quick thing I wanted to share with you. He said, to stop evil Islamic fundamentalism, the tragic Greeks would have readied the 101st Airborne and the Rangers. And the reason he would do that is because what he terms war as Zeus's curse. In an age of our greatest learning and wealth and pride is to descend into savagery when our sophisticated elite promise that prayer, talk, and money can yet prevail. And what he's talking about is giving them gifts to kind of stay them off, to appease them. And what he basically says, if we look through history and read Socrates and Pericles, they remind us that the real accomplices to evil are through inaction. So an interesting perspective. Wrapping this up, we talked about humor, and of course national defense, and especially talking about Islamic fascism, is not necessarily the funniest thing, but I do have a bit of humor I can kind of close this on. So a Muslim, a communist, and a socialist walk in the bar, and the bartender greets them. Hello, Mr. President. Just a personal view.
We can start that off with illegal women voters.
Yeah. So I had a last-minute opportunity to prepare for this, but I brought a lot of books and wanted to share some titles with you, and I'm happy to share with them. There's a little sign-up sheet if you want to take a book, read it, just which book, and get it back to me in within a year, maybe, if you have time. I'm happy to do that. But I wanted to share just some ideas because I don't have the answers. I'm not an expert as I started on national defense. I did not have the honor of serving our country. And yet, as a person of Jewish heritage, I'm concerned of what's happening in our world. I'm concerned not only for the Christians that are being slaughtered in the world, I'm concerned about all the ethnic groups that are being taken over and decimated. I'm concerned about Islam itself because I don't want to see a revisiting of what happened to the Japanese during World War II. I don't think that's the solution, to put people in camps. So there's got to be a way in a public policy manner that we come to some kind of understanding of what our position is in the world, how we address it. When we pull back from areas that we went to war, as an example in Iraq, there is hegemony. Iran rushed into that vacuum, and you see what we have today. So I'm not advocating that we go back. I'm not advocating that we have our young men and women in harm's way. But what I am advocating is that we have to be strong in our foreign policy and share that vision with our foes. Because the only thing they know is strength. The only thing they understand is force. And whether it is Islamic totalitarianism, or if it's Russia or China or North Korea, I think we're in a position right now in the world that puts us on shaky ground. So Islam is a problem if we make a religion a problem, but I don't think it's necessarily Islam. I think it's the radical aspect of it that has taken what we have today in our leadership and really incrementally push the envelope to where I don't know what our position is. It's all over the board. So it's food for thought, and I wanted to share those titles with you.